They say money can buy anything, a private island, a new identity, even silence. But for Julian Thorne, $10 billion couldn't buy a second night of love. Have you ever wondered what it's actually like to have it all? To stand on a balcony overlooking a city that you essentially own, knowing that every person below would trade their soul to be in your shoes? Wealth inequality isn't just about the numbers in a bank account. It's about the walls those numbers build around you. For most, the struggle is getting into the room. For Julian Thorne, the struggle was finding someone brave enough to stay in it. This is the story of Elara Vance, a woman who lived by the truth, and Julian Thorne, a man whose life was a beautiful gilded lie. It's a journey from the dusty offices of a struggling journalist to the marble halls of a man they called the Viper. Imagine a wedding dress made of pure silk, worth more than a suburban home, shredded on the floor of a penthouse. Imagine a woman screaming not in pain, but in sheer primitive terror as the man she just promised her life to begins to change. The candlelight flickers. The shadows on the wall stretch, thinning out into something long, sleek, and cold. But before the screams, there was the silence. Years ago, Julian wasn't a monster. He was a boy in a threadbare coat, watching his father lose everything to the very men Julian now commands. He swore he'd become so powerful, so dangerous, that no one could ever hurt him again. He got his wish. But the universe has a twisted way of balancing the scales. For every billion he earned, a piece of his humanity withered away, replaced by a cold reptilian instinct. You see, success at that level isn't just about hard work. Sometimes it's a deal. And Julian's deal came with a price tag that didn't have a dollar sign. It had a heartbeat. What you're about to discover over the next hour will change how you think about success forever. You'll realize that the people we envy the most are often the ones trapped in a nightmare we can't even imagine. Elara thought she was walking into the scoop of the century. She thought she was going to expose a financial fraud. She had no idea she was about to walk into a predator's den, and that the predator was desperately hoping she was the one who could finally break his curse. Before we begin this incredible 1-hour journey, I want to be honest with you. This video took over 48 hours to research, 20 hours to write, and nearly 60 hours to produce. Every detail you're about to hear was carefully crafted to bring you the most compelling, cinematic version of this story. If you appreciate that level of dedication to storytelling, please hit the subscribe button. It truly means the world and helps me continue creating these in-depth experiences for you. Before we dive into the first meeting between the hunter and the journalist, have you ever wondered what separates those who build lasting wealth from those who lose everything? Is it talent, or is it a sacrifice we can't see? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. The lights of Manhattan were blinding that Tuesday night, but for Elara Vance, the only thing that mattered was the man sitting at table 12. The man with the cold eyes and the billion-dollar secret to understand the monster Julian Thorne became. You first have to understand the boy who was forced to watch the world burn. Long before the custom-tailored Tom Ford suits and the $500 million headquarters in Hudson Yards, Julian lived in a place the brochures forget to mention. He grew up in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in South Boston, where the air always smelled like damp salt and disappointment. His father, Arthur Thorne, was a brilliant man, a local architect with dreams of building monuments. But in the late 90s, a predatory land developer, a man named Silas Vane, stripped Arthur of his patents, his pride, and eventually his will to live. Julian was 12 when he saw the eviction notice taped to their door. He stood on the sidewalk, clutching a box of his only belongings, and watched his father weep in front of the neighbors. It was a cold, sharp humiliation that carved itself into his bones. "Don't look at them, Julian," his father had whispered. But Julian did look. He looked at the sleek black car Silas Vane drove away in, and he made a silent vow. He would never be the one on the sidewalk again. He would be the one in the car. That drive wasn't just ambition. It was a survival mechanism. He worked 3 jobs to put himself through Harvard, living on coffee and spite. He didn't make friends. He made contacts. He didn't have hobbies. He had targets. By 32, Julian had built Thorne Industries. He didn't just compete. He colonized. He bought out the very firms that had ruined his father, crushing them with a clinical, detached cruelty. He was worth $10.2 billion on paper, but his soul was still that 12-year-old boy standing in the rain. But wealth at that level attracts more than just investors. It attracts shadows. As Julian's bank account grew, his humanity started to slip. It started with a strange coldness in his fingertips. Then the dreams began, vivid, terrifying dreams of shedding his skin. He sought out the best doctors in Switzerland, paid millions for experimental scans, but they found nothing. It wasn't medical. It was an ancestral debt coming due. A gift passed down from a bloodline he never knew he had, a bloodline that traded human warmth for cold-blooded power. While Julian was ascending his ivory tower, Elara Vance was digging in the dirt. Elara didn't come from money, but she came from integrity. Her father was a small-town whistleblower who lost his job for speaking the truth. She learned early on that the louder the polish, the deeper the rust. She worked for the Metropolitan Ledger, a dying print newspaper, in an office that smelled like old ink and desperation. She had one goal: find the connection between the recent string of disappeared socialites and the mysterious Julian Thorne. 7 women. All young, all beautiful, all wealthy. They all went on exactly one date with Julian. They weren't killed. They weren't kidnapped. But after that second night, they all checked themselves into private retreats, refusing to speak a word about him. Their eyes looked hollow, like they'd seen something the human mind wasn't built to process. The tension in the city was palpable. The media called him the billionaire bachelor, but in the dark corners of Reddit and the hushed corners of high society powder rooms, they called him something else: the shedder. Julian lived in a 15,000 square foot penthouse at the top of the Thorne Tower. It was a masterpiece of glass and steel, featuring a temperature-controlled vivarium that he claimed was for his exotic pets. But the staff whispered that no one ever saw the pets, only Julian, spending hours inside the humid tropical heat. The collision was inevitable. Elara managed to score an invite to the Thorne Foundation's annual gala by posing as a donor's daughter. She wore a borrowed vintage dress and carried a hidden recorder in her clutch. When their eyes met across the ballroom, the air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Julian didn't see a journalist. He saw a challenge. And Elara. She didn't see a billionaire. She saw a predator who had finally found something worth hunting. Julian walked toward her, his movement too fluid, too silent for a man of his size. He leaned in, his breath cold against her ear, and said, "You're looking for a story, Miss Vance. But be careful. Some stories have teeth." He didn't kick her out. Instead, he did something far more dangerous. He invited her to dinner. Private. In the penthouse. Tomorrow night. This brings us to a turning point. Julian grew up in the shadows of poverty and turned himself into a titan, but at a cost that defies nature. Elara grew up with nothing but the truth and is willing to risk her life to expose him. If you were born into Julian's circumstances, watching your family destroyed by the powerful, do you think you would have made the same choices to survive? Or would you have stayed on the sidewalk? Let me know what you think in the comments. The elevator didn't just carry Elara to the top floor of Thorne Tower. It carried her into a world where the laws of nature began to warp under the weight of $10 billion. The dinner started with a $5,000 bottle of Petrus and a silence so thick you could cut it with the sterling silver steak knives. Julian sat at the head of a mahogany table that could seat 30, yet he looked incredibly small against the backdrop of the New York skyline. Elara didn't play the part of the smitten socialite this time. She leaned forward, her recorder hidden in her silk purse, and asked the question that had killed the careers of 3 other journalists. "Julian, why do the women you love look like they've seen a ghost the morning after?" Julian didn't flinch. He didn't call security. He simply set his glass down, and for the first time, Elara noticed the texture of his skin. It wasn't just pale. It had a slight iridescent sheen, like oil on water. "They don't see ghosts, Elara," he whispered, his voice vibrating at a frequency that made the water in her glass ripple. "They see the truth of what it takes to stay at the top. Most people aren't built for the truth." The inciting incident happened at exactly 11:42 p.m. A sudden, violent thunderstorm shook the tower. The power flickered, a rarity for a building with its own independent grid. In that split second of darkness, Elara heard it. A low, rhythmic hissing sound, followed by the wet, sickening crunch of bone shifting against bone. When the emergency lights kicked in, Julian was hunched over, his back to her. His expensive silk shirt was tearing at the seams. He wasn't just having a seizure. He was undergoing a physical metamorphosis. Elara had a choice. She could run for the elevator and win a Pulitzer for the most insane story in history. Or she could stay. She saw a tear fall from Julian's eye, a human tear, before his pupils elongated into vertical slits. She chose to stay. Julian's curse wasn't just a metaphor for his greed. It was a literal, biological debt. Decades ago, to save his family from the streets, Julian's grandfather had made a pact with an entity older than the city itself. In exchange for the predatory instinct to dominate any market, his bloodline would physically transform into the very thing they simulated in the boardroom: cold-blooded apex predators. The reason no woman survived a second date wasn't because he killed them. It was because the transformation was triggered by true intimacy. The closer he felt to someone, the faster his human skin began to fail him. He was a man literally allergic to being loved. For the next hour of our story, we see the day-to-day reality of this nightmare. Julian and Elara began a dangerous game of cat and mouse, or rather, snake and journalist. She stayed in the penthouse for a week, ostensibly researching, but really she was becoming his anchor. She watched him manage billion-dollar mergers during the day with ice-cold precision, only to retreat to his heat-lamp-lined bedroom at night, screaming as his body fought against itself. She saw the obstacles. Silas Vane, the man who ruined Julian's father, was back. He was attempting a hostile takeover of Thorne Industries, sensing blood in the water. Julian was losing his grip. He couldn't focus on the stock market when his skin was peeling in agonizing sheets. The small wins kept them going. Elara found an old journal in the building's sub-basement, written by Julian's grandmother. It spoke of a counterweight, a way to stop the shedding. It wasn't a magic spell. It was a sacrifice. To break the curse, Julian had to be willing to lose everything his predatory side had built. He had to choose between his empire and his humanity. Relationships fractured. Julian's board of directors, led by a man who suspected Julian's illness, began a coup. They didn't care if he was a monster. They cared that the stock price was dropping. Elara, meanwhile, was being pressured by her editor. "Where's the story, Vance? Give us the dirt or you're fired." Everything came to a head when Silas Vane invited Julian to a private meeting on a yacht. He knew Julian's secret. He had been the one who tempted Julian's grandfather years ago. He wanted to watch Julian fully transform in front of the board, knowing it would legally disqualify him from running the company, leaving the Thorne empire ripe for the picking. Julian stood on the edge of the abyss. If he fought the transformation, the pain would kill him. If he embraced it, he would lose his company and his soul, but he would survive. At this point, Julian had to choose between two impossible paths. Option A, allow the transformation to happen, losing his $10 billion empire but saving his life and potentially finding a way to be with Elara. Or option B, take an experimental, highly dangerous suppressant that would keep him human long enough to destroy Silas Vane, but would likely stop his heart within hours. What would you have done? Would you choose the money and the power, or the chance at a normal life? This decision would define everything that came next. Let me know in the comments below. There is a specific kind of silence that happens when a $10 billion empire begins to rot from the inside out. The weeks following the gala weren't just a struggle. They were a descent into a living hell. Julian Thorne was no longer the hunter. He was the prey. Silas Vane had successfully planted rumors of Julian's mental instability across every major financial news outlet. Thorne Industries' stock plummeted. In just 48 hours, the company's valuation dropped by $2.4 billion. Investors were panicking. The board of directors, men Julian had handpicked and enriched, were now meeting in secret at the Harvard Club, plotting to invoke the incapacity clause in his contract. But the financial bleeding was nothing compared to the physical toll. Julian was spending 20 hours a day in the humid dark of his vivarium. The shedding had become constant. Every movement felt like glass shards under his skin. He was losing his voice, his speech becoming a raspy, guttural hiss that even Elara struggled to understand. Elara was his only link to the human world. She became his nurse, his guard, and his secret weapon. She spent her nights researching the Vane family history, fueled by a cocktail of caffeine and terror. She saw Julian at his most vulnerable, not as a titan of industry, but as a man huddled on a marble floor, weeping as his fingernails began to harden into something sharp and inhuman. "Leave me, Elara," he hissed one night, his eyes glowing with an unnatural amber light. "Save yourself before there's nothing left of the man to love." But Elara didn't leave. She had seen the way Silas Vane looked at Julian, with the hunger of a man who didn't just want the money, but wanted the soul of his rival. She realized then that Julian's curse wasn't a random act of fate. It was a weapon Silas had been waiting to trigger for decades. The pressure reached a breaking point when the SEC launched an official investigation into Thorne Industries. Federal agents were at the door with subpoenas. Julian couldn't appear in public. The transformation had progressed too far. If the world saw him now, it wouldn't just be a scandal. It would be a global phenomenon that would end in a laboratory cage. Support came from an unexpected source. Marcus, Julian's long-suffering head of security. Marcus had seen the snake years ago and stayed silent out of a deep, unspoken loyalty to Julian's father. He provided the offshore accounts and the encrypted lines Elara needed to start her counteroffensive. Julian was at his lowest. His board had turned, his body was failing, and Silas Vane was days away from a total takeover. Elara suggested they take his remaining liquid assets, roughly $400 million, and vanish to a remote part of the world where Julian could live out his days in peace, away from the prying eyes of society. But Julian refused. He wanted to stay and fight, even if it meant being exposed. Do you think Julian should have taken the money and run? Or was there another way forward? Share your perspective below. Julian chose to fight. But to do it, he had to embrace the monster. He stopped taking the suppressants. He allowed the scales to harden. He realized that the only way to beat a predator like Silas Vane was to be the apex predator in the room. He began orchestrating a short squeeze that would trap Silas Vane's own capital. Using Elara as his voice, he leaked confidential documents that led Silas to believe Julian was selling off his shares. Silas took the bait, borrowing billions to buy the falling stock, unaware that Julian was actually buying it all back through a web of shell companies Marcus had set up. This was the turning point. Julian's character was being forged in the fire of his own curse. He learned that power wasn't about the suit or the office. It was about the will. He started to use his heightened senses, the ability to hear a heartbeat from across a room, the instinct to sense a lie before it was spoken, to dismantle his enemies from the shadows. Elara, too, found a new strength. She wasn't just a journalist anymore. She was a strategist. She drafted the articles that would eventually expose Silas Vane's long history of corporate sabotage and his role in the elder Thorne's ruin. They were no longer just surviving. They were preparing for a confrontation that would shake the foundations of the city. The act ends with a chilling development. Silas Vane sent a final message to the penthouse. It wasn't a legal threat. It was a photograph of Elara's childhood home. He knew about her. He knew she was the anchor. And he was coming for the anchor to sink the ship. We are at the midpoint of this incredible, dark journey. Julian is halfway between man and beast, and the stakes have moved from the boardroom to a battle for their very lives. If you're still here, I genuinely appreciate you. This is a long story, and your support means everything. What's kept you engaged so far? Is it the romance, the revenge, or the mystery of the curse? Let me know in the comments. The final battle wasn't going to happen in a court of law. It was going to happen at the Thorne Tower Masquerade Ball, the one night a year where everyone wears a mask, and the monster can finally show his face. There is a moment in every battle where the prey stops running, turns around, and reveals that it was never a victim. It was a trap. For Julian Thorne, that moment arrived at 4 a.m. on a cold Tuesday in November. For weeks, the world thought he was hiding in shame. Silas Vane had already begun drafting the press release announcing his takeover of Thorne Industries. But while Vane was celebrating, Julian was undergoing a transformation that had nothing to do with his bank account. The breakthrough didn't happen in a boardroom. It happened when Julian finally stopped fighting the monster and started listening to it. He realized the curse wasn't a punishment for his greed. It was a manifestation of it. To control the snake, he had to master his own soul. With Elara by his side, Julian began a rigorous, almost monastic rebuilding of his life. He liquidated his secret offshore holdings, $1.2 billion in untraceable assets, not to hide them, but to launch a silent surgical strike on Silas Vane's infrastructure. The dynamic between Julian and Elara shifted from nurse and patient to something far more formidable. They were no longer two people trying to survive a curse. They were architects of a new reality. Julian's physical pain began to recede, replaced by a terrifying, hyper-focused calm. "I spent my life trying to be a man people feared," Julian whispered. His voice now a smooth, resonant baritone again. "Now, I don't care if they fear me. I only care if they see me for what I truly am." Elara saw the change. It wasn't just the lack of scales. It was the presence of empathy. For the first time, Julian used his resources to quietly settle the debts of the family Silas Vane had crushed over the years. He was rebuilding his reputation not through PR, but through integrity. As Julian's internal peace grew, so did his external power. He secured a secret alliance with the very board members who had tried to oust him. By showing them the evidence Elara had gathered, proof that Silas Vane intended to strip the company and fire 20,000 employees the moment he took control. One by one, the traitors became double agents. They continued to feed Silas false information, leading him to believe Julian was weak and ready to surrender. In reality, the stage was being set for a final public revelation that would either cure Julian or destroy him forever. While the corporate war raged, a smaller, more human story was unfolding. Elara had been quietly supporting her younger sister's education using her own savings, refusing to take a dime of Julian's cursed money. However, seeing Julian's transformation, his willingness to lose his billions to save his humanity, changed her. She allowed him to mentor her sister in business, watching as Julian's once predatory instincts were channeled into teaching a young woman how to protect herself in a world of wolves. It was his first taste of a legacy that wasn't built on fear. The series of wins began to snowball. Julian's health stabilized. The shedding stopped occurring randomly and only flickered when his temper flared. He was learning to channel the beast's energy into a magnetic, commanding presence. He didn't need the Tom Ford suits anymore, though he still wore them. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had stared into the abyss and made the abyss blink. Silas Vane, meanwhile, was over-leveraged. He had spent billions buying Thorne stock at inflated prices, unaware that the floor was about to be pulled out from under him. The setting for the climax was the Thorne Tower's midnight masquerade. It was the anniversary of Julian's father's ruin. Silas Vane arrived, unmasked and arrogant, ready to sign the final merger papers that would dissolve Thorne Industries. He thought he was walking into a room full of sycophants. He didn't know that every guest was wearing a mask for a reason. And he certainly didn't know that under Julian's mask, there was no longer a frightened boy or a hiding monster, but a man who had finally integrated both. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Julian stood at the top of the grand staircase. He looked down at the man who had destroyed his family, and for the first time in his life, he felt no hatred. Only a cold, crystalline clarity. At this point, Julian has transformed into someone completely different. He's no longer the billionaire viper who hid from the world, but a leader who uses his curse as a shield for others. Do you think people can truly change their core nature, or do we just learn better ways to hide who we really are? This is crucial for what's about to happen when the masks come off. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm reading all of them. The most dangerous thing about a monster isn't the teeth or the scales. It's the moment it looks you in the eye and speaks the absolute truth. The Thorne Tower ballroom was a sea of velvet masks and whispered lies. At the center of the room stood Silas Vane, holding a fountain pen like a scepter. He was surrounded by the press, the board of directors, and a legal team ready to sign the death warrant of Julian's legacy. Silas believed he had already won. He had manipulated the market, leveraged his entire net worth to buy Julian's debt, and was now waiting for a broken man to emerge from the shadows. He didn't know that the broken man was currently standing 10 feet away from him, hidden behind a simple obsidian mask, watching him with predatory patience. Julian's mindset had shifted. The fear that had fueled his curse for decades was gone, replaced by a crystalline calm. He wasn't there for revenge. He was there for justice. Beside him, Elara looked radiant in a dress that shimmered like moonlight on dark water, a silent nod to the secret they both carried. She squeezed his hand. His skin was warm, human, and steady. For the first time in his life, the beast was silent because the man was finally in control. Silas tapped his microphone, the sound echoing through the cavernous hall. "I'd like to thank you all for coming to witness the end of an era," he sneered. "It seems our host, Mr. Thorne, is indisposed. Perhaps he's shedding some responsibilities." The room went cold as Julian stepped forward, removing his mask. He wasn't the pale, sickly figure the tabloids had described. He looked powerful, his presence filling the room with an almost magnetic intensity. He wore a custom midnight blue suit, but it was his eyes that stopped Silas mid-sentence. They weren't glowing, but they possessed a terrifying depth. "I'm not indisposed, Silas," Julian said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "I was just waiting for you to sign the line that puts your entire fortune at risk." The shock on Silas's face was cinematic. He looked at the documents in his hand, then at his own lawyers, who suddenly wouldn't meet his gaze. Julian revealed the truth. While Silas was buying falling stock, Julian and Elara had exposed Silas's illegal short-selling schemes to the SEC an hour prior. The debt Silas thought he owned had been restructured. By signing those papers, Silas hadn't taken over Thorne Industries. He had legally tethered his own crumbling company to Julian's bad assets, which were now being liquidated to pay back the family Silas had ruined. Publicly, and in front of the very cameras Silas had invited to capture Julian's downfall, the tables turned. Elara stepped forward, handing a tablet to the lead investigator. It contained the digital fingerprints of Silas's decades-long corporate sabotage, including the evidence that he had set up Julian's father 30 years ago. The witnesses didn't just see a corporate victory. They saw a moral one. The board members Silas thought he'd bought stood behind Julian in a silent wall of support. The billionaire viper was gone. In his place stood a man who had used his greatest weakness to find his greatest strength. Justice was served naturally. Silas Vane wasn't dragged out in handcuffs. Not yet. He was left standing alone in the center of a room that had already moved on from him. He was a man who had spent his life trying to create monsters, only to find he was the only one left in the room. Julian didn't gloat. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply turned to Marcus and said, "Show Mr. Vane to the door. He doesn't belong here anymore." As the room began to fill with the sound of music again, Julian walked out onto the balcony with Elara. The city lights twinkled below, but they didn't look like targets anymore. They looked like stars. Julian realized that revenge wasn't what he needed. The curse hadn't been broken by a magic spell or a secret cure. It had been broken by the truth. By refusing to be the predator Silas wanted him to be, Julian had finally become a man. The snake was no longer a secret to be feared. It was a part of his history that he had finally outgrown. The confrontation is over. Julian chose to win through integrity and strategy rather than the cold-blooded cruelty he was cursed with. Do you feel satisfied with how this played out? Or would you have wanted Julian to be more vindictive towards Silas? There's no wrong answer here. I want to know if you think justice was truly served. But as the sun began to rise over Manhattan, Julian and Elara knew that while the battle for the company was won, their true journey was just beginning. Because there was one more secret waiting in the shadows of the Thorne family history. The dust has finally settled on the Thorne Empire, but the real story isn't about the money that was saved, it's about the man who was found. 6 months have passed since that fateful masquerade ball, and the world of high finance looks very different today. Silas Vane, once the most feared predator in the city, is currently navigating a world where his name is toxic. After the SEC investigation concluded, his assets were frozen, and he was forced to declare a humiliating personal bankruptcy. He didn't go to a glamorous minimum security prison. He simply became irrelevant. He lives in a small rented apartment in the suburbs, the very kind of ordinary life he spent decades mocking. His phone doesn't ring. His loyal associates have vanished. He is a man who tried to use a curse to destroy others, only to realize he was the only true monster in the room. Meanwhile, Thorne Industries has undergone a radical transformation. Julian didn't just reclaim his throne. He redesigned it. He pivoted the company toward ethical tech and transparency, moving away from the winner-takes-all mentality that nearly cost him his humanity. The most shocking change, however, was Julian himself. The iridescence in his skin? Gone. The coldness in his touch? Replaced by a steady human warmth. Doctors can't explain it, but Elara can. The curse didn't end because of a medicine. It ended because Julian stopped acting like a predator and started acting like a partner. Julian often sits on the same balcony where he once stood alone, but now he's never by himself. He looks back at the snake years not with shame, but with a strange kind of gratitude. He realizes that the curse was a mirror. It showed him exactly what he was becoming. Cold, calculating, and detached, before it was too late to change. Hardship didn't just break me, he told Elara recently. It peeled back the layers of who I thought I had to be, until only the truth was left. He understands now that Silas Vane's cruelty was actually a gift, a catalyst that forced him to choose between $1 billion cage and a truly free life. Today, Elara Vance isn't just a journalist. She's the head of a foundation that protects whistleblowers and exposes corporate corruption. She and Julian are a power couple of a different kind, one built on trust instead of leverage. Even Elara's younger sister has thrived, graduating at the top of her class and entering the business world with the mentorship of a man who knows exactly where the traps are hidden. The cycle of trauma that started with Julian's father on that sidewalk 30 years ago has finally been broken. The Thorne name no longer inspires fear. It inspires hope. In the final shot of our journey, we see Julian and Elara walking through a public park, unmasked and unbothered. There are no bodyguards, no frantic phone calls, and most importantly, no secrets. Julian catches his reflection in a pond. His eyes are clear, his smile is genuine, and his skin is just skin. He didn't just survive the second date. He found a lifetime. The man who was once a snake has finally learned how to walk on the earth with a light heart and a clear soul. Looking at where everyone ended up, Silas in his lonely apartment and Julian in his new life. Do you believe in karma? Or is this just the natural consequence of the choices they made? I want to hear what you think in the comments. Your perspective on this journey means the world to me. This has been the incredible, twisted story of the CEO's secret curse. If you enjoyed this 170-minute journey into the heart of wealth, power, and transformation, please give this video a like and share it with someone who loves a deep story. Don't forget to check out our other deep dives on the screen right now. Thank you for watching, for subscribing, and for being part of this community. Until next time, remember, the most powerful thing you can be in this world is yourself. At the end of every great storm, the air is clearer than it has ever been, revealing a truth that the clouds were hiding all along. We've traveled a long road with Julian and Elara. We've seen the $10 billion penthouses, the agonizing transformations, and the boardroom battles that felt like life and death. But as we close this chapter, it's important to look at the bigger picture. This story was never really about a billionaire who turned into a snake. It was about a man who was so terrified of being powerless that he built a shell around his heart, and the woman who was brave enough to see past the armor. Getty Images. The real meaning of wealth isn't found in a diversified portfolio or a high-rise in Manhattan. It's found in the quiet moments of character that no one else sees. Julian's true success didn't happen when he defeated Silas Vane. It happened when he decided that being human was worth more than being invincible. If you're watching this and you feel like you're in the middle of your own shedding period, where life is stripping away everything you thought you needed, remember Julian. Hardship isn't a sign that you're failing. Often, it's the universe forcing you to outgrow a skin that has become too tight for the person you're meant to become. Julian's philosophy today is simple. Control your ego, or it will eventually control you. He's changed from a man who wanted to own the world to a man who wants to contribute to it. He realized that the greatest power isn't the ability to crush your enemies, but the resilience to rise after you've been crushed yourself. And what about the next generation? The struggle Julian and Elara endured has become the fertile soil for their children's future. By breaking the generational pattern of power through fear, they've given their family a legacy of integrity. Their children won't grow up in the shadow of a curse. They'll grow up seeing a father who wasn't afraid to be vulnerable and a mother who refused to trade the truth for a paycheck. That kind of wisdom is worth more than any inheritance. It's the kind of preparation that ensures they'll never be victims of people like Silas Vane. Speaking of Silas, there is a strange peace in his downfall. Julian doesn't look back at him with bitterness or a sense of triumph. In fact, he rarely thinks of him at all. When you truly find peace with your journey, you realize that your antagonists weren't villains in your story. They were merely tests. Silas chose a path of vindictiveness and greed, and he is living the natural consequence of those choices. His opinion, which once dictated Julian's every move, now carries no weight. The silence of Silas Vane is the loudest proof of Julian's victory. There is a universal lesson here for all of us. We spend so much of our lives measuring our worth by other people's standards. We chase the billion-dollar dream, the perfect image, the status that makes us feel safe. But true safety comes from within. It comes from the power of loving yourself through your most painful transformations. Integrity isn't just a moral choice. It's a strategic one. As Julian found out, when everything else is stripped away, the money, the title, the very skin on your back, your character is the only thing that remains. And if your character is strong, you can rebuild anything. Looking at where everyone ended up, do you believe in karma? Or is this just the natural consequence of choices? I've seen so many different takes on this story in the community, and I want to hear yours. Does Julian deserve his happy ending, or was the cost too high? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for staying with me through this incredible journey. This story took hundreds of hours to bring to life, and having you here until the final second means the world. If this story moved you, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We have more deep dives into the lives of the world's most mysterious figures coming very soon. Remember, your current struggle is just the skin you're shedding. The version of you that's coming is stronger than you can imagine. I'm the Story Keeper, and I'll see you in the next story. We began this journey at the top of a glass tower with a man who had everything but himself, and we ended on the ground with a man who has finally found his soul. It's been a long 3 hours. We've watched Julian Thorne transition from a cold, predatory titan into a man who chose vulnerability over a billion-dollar curse. We saw Elara Vance go from a hunter of secrets to a partner in redemption. Think back to the turning points. The moment Elara chose to stay during the first transformation, the night Julian refused to run with his remaining millions, and that final electric confrontation where the masks finally came off. This wasn't just a story about a snake secret. It was a story about the masks we all wear to protect ourselves from being hurt, and the courage it takes to shed them. What makes this story significant isn't the wealth or the supernatural twist. It's the universal truth that we are all capable of shedding our past. Whether your curse is a mistake you made, a trauma you've carried, or a reputation you've outgrown, you are not stuck in that skin. Julian proved that the very thing that makes you feel like a monster might actually be the catalyst for your greatest strength, if you're brave enough to face it. This story matters because it reminds us that even in the highest boardrooms and the darkest nights, integrity is the only currency that never devalues. As you turn off this video and return to your own life, I want you to take one thing with you. Your circumstances do not define your worth. You might be standing on the sidewalk today, just like 12-year-old Julian, watching the world take everything from you. Or you might be at the top, terrified that people will see who you really are. Either way, remember that the best response to the cruelty of the world isn't to become a predator. It's to build a life so authentic, so full of purpose and love, that the critics and the Silas Vanes of your life eventually become background noise. You are the architect of your own transformation. If this story moved you, inspired you, or taught you something valuable about resilience and success, please leave a like and share your biggest takeaway in the comments below. Was it the moment of the second date? The final unmasking? Or Julian's choice to help others? I read every single comment, and your insights are what make this community of storytellers so special. Remember, you are not defined by what others think of you. You are defined by how you respond when life tests you. Julian Thorne proved that the best response to cruelty isn't revenge. It's building a life so beautiful that your critics become irrelevant. Until next time, stay strong, stay focused, and never let anyone convince you that you're nothing. You are everything you choose to become. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next story.